The golden age of classic Hollywood, a time of sparkle, glamour, and unparalleled beauty. Yet, beneath the surface of the silver screen lay a hidden reality, a world governed by powerful studio executives who exerted total control over their stars' lives. They held the power to create and the power to destroy. This is the story buried beneath the magnificent sets and red carpets. The era when the dream factories themselves turned into weapons against their biggest assets. Have you ever wondered why an actor who appeared bravest on screen felt terrified of their own boss behind closed doors? Hollywood's power center was not just the box office. It was a contract that made a celebrity's private life the property of the studio. Sexual orientation, illicit affairs, financial indiscretions, and drug use. These were the dirty secrets that studios weaponized as blackmail. Their goal was simple: maintain the perfect image or lose your career and reputation. Rock Hudson was forced into a sham marriage to hide his homosexuality. Judy Garland's fragile health and addiction were tightly controlled by the studio to keep her working. Ingrid Bergman faced public shaming and threats of career ruin just for falling in love. These are just a few examples. In this video, we will unveil the names of 12 famous stars from classic Hollywood who were blackmailed by the very studios that made them famous. We will explore how morality clauses and purity clauses became legal tools for stripping away free will. This is the true story of glamour and coercion, a world where the biggest heroes and heroines were prisoners of their own creators. Actor 1 Rock Hudson. We have journeyed through the dark underbelly of Hollywood's golden age, uncovering the shocking truth behind the glamour. The stories of these 12 stars, from the enforced marriages of Rock Hudson to the chemical dependency orchestrated for Judy Garland and the mental health weaponization against Frances Farmer, reveal a systemic betrayal. The contracts signed by these idols were not just agreements to act, they were documents of surrender. The studio system, powered by executives like Louis B. Mayer, didn't just manage careers. They owned the private lives, sexual identities, and emotional well-being of their stars. The mechanism of control was always the same: fear of exposure. Whether it was a secret affair, like Ingrid Bergman, a hidden orientation, like Ramon Novarro, or a volatile personal life, like Lana Turner, the studios meticulously collected this sensitive information. This data became their ultimate tool of blackmail, a constant, unspoken threat that forced obedience, guaranteed cheap labor, and upheld the profitable, yet entirely fake, facade of Hollywood morality. These stars were imprisoned by their own fame. Their talent built a dynasty, but their humanity was crushed by it. The ultimate tragedy is that in their relentless pursuit of the perfect image and billion-dollar box office returns, the studios sacrificed the people they were supposed to protect. The lights of the golden age may have shone brightly, but they cast long, deep shadows over the lives of those trapped beneath them. Their stories serve as a perpetual reminder of the immense personal cost paid for cinematic perfection. Actor 2, Judy Garland. The studio's chemical control. Judy Garland. A voice of singular brilliance, she was MGM's ultimate asset and their most tragic victim. Discovered as a child, she was transformed into the girl-next-door icon, Dorothy Gale. But her studio experience was a nightmare of chemical dependency and control. Garland's contract with MGM was a total surrender of autonomy. Studio head Louis B. Mayer often subjected her to emotional manipulation, reinforcing her deep-seated insecurities. The core of the studio's blackmail wasn't a hidden scandal, but a manufactured addiction. To manage the grueling, 72-hour work weeks and suppress her appetite, ensuring she maintained her youthful, slender look, studio doctors provided her with a cocktail of powerful drugs: uppers, amphetamines, to work relentlessly, and downers, sleeping pills, to force rest. This institutionalized drug provision was the ultimate form of control. If Garland showed resistance, or if her emotional fragility became too public, the studio threatened to expose her erratic behavior, financial instability, and unprofessionalism to the press, effectively ending her career. She was constantly monitored and weighed. When she started showing signs of addiction, the studio labeled her difficult and unreliable, knowing this narrative kept her subservient. She was often forced back to work immediately after a breakdown, her vulnerability exploited for profit. The threat was clear: obey, work, and keep the secret of your chemical dependence, or be publicly dismissed as a madwoman and a failure. This pattern of control, initiated by MGM's brutal schedule and coercion, ultimately defined her tragic life. Actor 3. Montgomery Clift, the closeted intellectual. Montgomery Clift, the brooding, sensitive counterpoint to the traditional masculine stars. He was the intellectual heartthrob, ushering in the era of method acting. Yet, beneath the intensity of his performances lay a devastating secret that made him a prime target for studio manipulation. Clift was gay. Unlike the major studios that owned stars like Hudson, Clift preferred freelance contracts, which offered him some artistic freedom. However, his private life, driven by intense emotion and deep privacy, was constantly scrutinized by the press and those around him. The blackmail came in two waves, both exploiting his sexuality and his instability. First, the implicit threat. His agents and handlers constantly warned him that public knowledge of his orientation would immediately destroy his career. This pressure forced him into a deep closet, creating immense psychological strain which manifested as self-destructive behavior and heavy substance abuse. The studios tacitly controlled him by using his secret as the ultimate leverage. The second wave followed his near-fatal car accident in 1956. The crash permanently disfigured his face and intensified his pain and addiction. The studios demanded he continue working immediately to protect their investment, fearing that his physical and mental collapse would derail major projects. They forced him to hide the extent of his injuries and his dependency, ensuring his public appearances maintained the image of the stoic, troubled genius. Clift's refusal to conform to traditional Hollywood standards, coupled with his secret life, meant he was perpetually vulnerable. The industry's insistence on silence regarding his identity, using the threat of exposure to control his actions and force him to work despite his poor health, became a prolonged form of emotional and professional blackmail. Actor 4. Ingrid Bergman, the public scandal. Ingrid Bergman, an Oscar-winning actress, known globally for her saintly innocence and radiant purity. She was the star of classics like Casablanca, meticulously crafted by Hollywood to embody moral perfection. Her image was her most valuable and most vulnerable asset. Bergman's blackmail was fundamentally different from others. It was the studio system manipulating and amplifying public outrage to destroy her career when she defied the strict morality clauses they enforced. The crisis erupted during the filming of Stromboli, 1949, where Bergman began a passionate affair with the director, Roberto Rossellini. Crucially, both were married to other people at the time. When the news broke, and it was later revealed she was pregnant with Rossellini's child, the studio system, along with powerful conservative figures in the U.S. Senate, launched a campaign of condemnation. Her former studio, RKO, among others, and the prevailing moral authorities exploited the scandal. While they did not possess a secret to expose, they used the threat of total professional and social annihilation. They cut off work, denounced her publicly, and ensured she was labeled a powerful influence for evil. Bergman was effectively blacklisted from Hollywood. The studios, protecting their own puritanical standards and contracts, made an example of her. The threat was, return to your husband and uphold the contract's morality clause, or you will never work in America again. She chose love and exile, moving to Italy. It took years for her to rehabilitate her image and return to American cinema, illustrating the devastating power the studios wielded by mobilizing public shame as a form of coercive control and professional punishment. Actor 5. Joan Crawford, the ruthless reinvention. Joan Crawford, a symbol of resilience and glamorous intensity, her career spanned decades and transitions. From the flapper of the silent era to the hardened, Oscar-winning dramatic lead, Crawford's relentless ambition was legendary. MGM, particularly Louis B. Mayer, controlled her rise, but this control came with constant threat and manipulation. Crawford's personal life was complex, marked by numerous high-profile relationships, intense rivalry, especially with Bette Davis, and profound psychological struggles, which later included documented issues related to her adopted children. The studio's blackmail was centered on two critical points: controlling her image and leveraging her ambition. First, MGM maintained a vast, heavily guarded file on her volatile temperament, her affairs, and any behavior deemed unladylike or unmarketable. This file served as a constant threat. If she became too demanding, or if her behavior threatened the studio's financial interests, the contents of the file would be leaked to gossip columnists, or worse, used in court proceedings to discredit her. Second, Mayor New Crawford needed the spotlight to validate herself. The ultimate coercion was the threat of irrelevance. When she demanded better roles or higher pay, the studio would sideline her, assigning her to be pictures, or worse, threatening to terminate her contract and let her face the unemployment of a career without the MGM machine. This forced her to constantly reinvent herself and accept roles, regardless of the psychological cost. Crawford was a star who willingly participated in some of the studio's schemes for publicity, yet she was always subjected to their internal threats. Her drive to remain a top star ensured she stayed perpetually under the thumb of the studio, who used the potential ruin of her meticulously crafted public persona to demand absolute obedience. Actor 6, Elizabeth Taylor, the morality clause megaswitch. Elizabeth Taylor. She arrived in Hollywood as a child star, growing up under the intense, protective, and controlling gaze of MGM. Taylor was the embodiment of beauty and scandal, a magnetic personality whose private life became public domain, constantly threatening the family-friendly image the studio demanded. MGM's control over Taylor was absolute from her youth. The studio ensured she was educated, dressed, and publicized in a way that maximized her appeal, often overlooking her age. The inherent blackmail came through the stringent morality clauses embedded in her contracts, which covered everything from her weight to her relationships. The threats began with her tumultuous romantic life. Taylor married young and frequently, generating massive negative publicity every time she defied the era's conservative norms. The studio, rather than protecting her, used the threat of contract termination and subsequent financial ruin to force her compliance in covering up or mitigating scandalous affairs. The most famous coercive event was the Eddie Fisher scandal. In 1958, Taylor was married to Mike Todd when Todd tragically died. Within months, Taylor began an affair with Todd's best friend, Eddie Fisher, who was married to America's sweetheart, Debbie Reynolds. The public backlash was volcanic, labeling Taylor a homewrecker. MGM, while furious, realized the immense financial value of the scandal itself. They did not terminate her contract, but instead used the threat of exposure and public condemnation to force her into one of the most demanding contracts in history for Cleopatra. They essentially allowed the blackmail of public opinion to escalate, only intervening to profit from the notoriety, ensuring she was compliant and desperate for work, which they offered only on their punishing terms. Her private life became a tool for the studio to control her professional worth. Actor 7, Errol Flynn, the cover-up king. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling hero, famed for his athletic grace and roguish charm in films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood. Warner Brothers presented him as the epitome of adventurous masculinity. Behind the scenes, however, Flynn's life was riddled with alcohol abuse, gambling debts, and predatory behavior toward young women. Warner Brothers was acutely aware of the star's self-destructive habits. The studio did not merely know his secrets. They actively participated in the cover-up operation, using the threat of exposure as continuous leverage over his career and salary. The implicit blackmail was constant. Work harder, appear compliant, and keep delivering hits, or the studio would withdraw their legal and public relations shield, allowing the dozens of scandals accumulating around him to destroy him instantly. The system was tested severely in the early 1940s when Flynn faced statutory rape charges involving two minors, Betty Hansen and Peggy Satterley. This was potentially a career-ending, life-ruining scandal. Warner Brothers used their immense power and resources to manipulate the legal proceedings and media narrative. They hired top defense lawyers and mobilized their publicists to discredit the accusers. While they protected him legally, the studio ensured Flynn understood the true cost of their intervention. After his acquittal, which was widely doubted by the public, the studio's control intensified. They could hold the knowledge of the numerous past and future indiscretions over him, forcing him into rigorous work schedules and denying him better contract terms. Flynn became wholly dependent on the studio's protective machinery. Without it, his career and freedom were guaranteed to collapse. The continuous threat of abandoning him to the consequences of his actions was the studio's ultimate coercive tool. Actor 8. Marlene Dietrich. The sexual fluidity trap. Marlene Dietrich, the epitome of European sophistication, androgynous glamour, and cynical allure. Paramount Pictures crafted her as a mysterious, exotic figure. While her on-screen persona was one of bold independence, her career was tightly controlled by the studio, often leveraging aspects of her complex personal life. Dietrich's most significant threat was not one single scandal, but her sexual fluidity and her relationships with both men and women, which were highly unconventional for the era. She openly maintained an open marriage and had numerous, high-profile bisexual affairs, facts that, if fully exposed, would violate every morality clause and shatter her carefully maintained exotic mystique in conservative America. The studio's form of blackmail was persistent contractual pressure and image management. They knew her relationships were risky and used that knowledge to demand absolute compliance with their projects, regardless of quality or personal cost. When her films started to underperform in the mid-1930s, Paramount labeled her box office poison. This public demotion was itself a form of coercive control. The studio knew the secrets and essentially told her, "You are failing publicly, and if you do not accept the roles we assign, we will not only terminate your contract, but allow the true stories of your private life to leak, confirming the public's judgment of your immorality." This threat forced Dietrich into a grueling, career-saving pivot to cabaret and stage work, and eventually, wartime efforts. The studio held the key to her past affairs and non-traditional marriage. Her constant need for financial security and image protection kept her subservient, always performing under the shadow of the secrets they held, ready to be deployed if she stepped out of line professionally. Actor 9. Greta Garbo, the isolated mystery. Greta Garbo, the divine, the ultimate cinematic enigma. Her fame was built on her fierce privacy and the unforgettable phrase, "I want to be alone." MGM cultivated this mystery, making her one of the most powerful and protected stars of the 1930s. Garbo's reclusiveness was not just personal preference. It was a strategy amplified by MGM to manage her profound secret, her complex, often ambiguous sexuality. Her intense relationships with women, coupled with a deep discomfort with public life, made her extremely vulnerable to exposure. The studio's blackmail was twofold, leveraging her financial demands and controlling the narrative of her seclusion. First, MGM used her need for privacy against her. Every time Garbo demanded a huge salary, she was one of the highest-paid stars of her time. The studio's executives would subtly remind her that her continued professional success depended entirely on their ability to suppress the truth about her affairs and personal life, which they meticulously tracked. This implied threat kept her from demanding complete artistic control or breaking her contractual obligations. Second, the studio maintained control by fueling the mystery narrative. They strictly policed her public appearances and ensured her isolation was viewed as romantic and artistic, not symptomatic of deep personal distress or a need to hide her relationships. If she threatened to leave the studio system entirely, the counter-threat was the immediate and deliberate release of true details about her life. Details that would transform her from a divine mystery into a moral outcast, ruining the ethereal image that was her financial trademark. Ultimately, the studio's constant threat of exposure regarding her true emotional life forced her into increasingly demanding roles and perpetuated the isolation that defined her career until she retired from the screen at the age of 35. Actor 10. Lana Turner, the scandal machine. Lana Turner, the ultimate sweater girl, a blonde bombshell whose glamour was often overshadowed by her tumultuous personal life. MGM positioned her as the ultimate temptress, but her string of chaotic marriages and volatile relationships constantly threatened the studio's carefully constructed image. Turner's career was defined by the perpetual struggle to contain her private life. The studio's blackmail was centered on their ability to manage and profit from her scandals, while simultaneously using them as leverage. The implicit threat was constant. Obey the terms of the contract and continue to deliver box office hits, or MGM would stop providing the necessary legal and public relations shielding required to keep her personal chaos out of the courts and the harshest headlines. The coercive control reached its peak during the most sensational scandal of the era in 1958. Turner's volatile gangster boyfriend, Johnny Stompanato, was stabbed to death in her home by her 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane. This event was a nightmare for the studio. They did not cause the scandal, but they immediately seized control of the narrative. MGM publicists, acting under the studio's authority, carefully managed every detail of the police investigation and the subsequent inquest. They coached Turner and her daughter on their testimony, ensuring the final narrative was one of a mother protecting her child from a violent mobster. The threat was clear. The studio would protect her and her daughter from the legal fallout and public ruin only if she remained compliant, immediately returned to work, and accepted the punishing roles and schedule they dictated. This coercion ensured her complete submission to the studio system during a period when she was emotionally most vulnerable, effectively blackmailed by her own need for legal and public protection. Actor 11. Ramon Novarro, The Silent Lover, revised. Ramon Novarro, a major star of the silent and early sound eras, promoted by MGM as the Latin lover, a sophisticated, intensely romantic rival to Rudolph Valentino. Novarro's persona was based on passionate, heterosexual romance, making his true identity, that he was gay, a profound liability for the studio. MGM was fully aware of Novarro's sexuality. This secret was the constant, existential threat that enabled the studio's blackmail and total control over his personal choices. The studio's method was relentless surveillance and enforced silence. They assigned Minders whose primary job was ensuring Novarro's private encounters remained hidden. He was perpetually warned that any slip-up, any rumor, would lead to immediate contract termination and public ruin, destroying his profitable romantic idol image. The coercion was heightened by financial vulnerability. While Novarro earned vast sums, the studio kept him reliant on them, often controlling the flow of money. He was forced to accept a grueling slate of films, often against his artistic wishes, because resisting the studio meant risking the exposure that would immediately cut off his income and leave him professionally dead. A notable incident occurred in 1935 when Novarro attempted to buy out his contract to gain independence and pursue a more authentic life. MGM flatly refused. They leveraged their knowledge of his hidden life, making it clear that if he left their protection, they would deliberately allow the press to print the details of his sexuality. The threat of professional death and public disgrace forced him to remain isolated and compliant, performing a role both on and off screen. This systemic coercion kept a major star emotionally captive and financially dependent for years, purely to maintain the profitable Latin lover facade. Actor 12. Frances Farmer, The Rebellious Victim. Frances Farmer, a fiercely intelligent and talented actress who came to Hollywood seeking artistic freedom, but instead became one of the studio system's most tragic cautionary tales. Paramount Pictures quickly branded her as difficult and rebellious due to her nonconformist attitude and refusal to participate in the studio's publicity machine. Farmer's blackmail was unique. The studio used her genuine defiance and later, her very real mental health struggles, as a weapon to exert total control and ultimately destroy her career when she ceased being compliant. When Farmer started to refuse shallow roles and demanded control over her scripts, the studio began a systematic campaign to undermine her. They started leveraging her minor legal infractions and increasing volatility, labeling her as a maniac and unstable to the press. This narrative served as a constant threat. Cooperate, or we will publish the proof of your supposed insanity, making you unemployable. As her behavior became more erratic due to psychological distress and battles with alcohol, the studio actively assisted in her legal downfall. They often refused to post bail or provide legal counsel during her arrests in the early 1940s, essentially abandoning her to the legal system while ensuring the press covered every humiliating detail. The coercion peaked when, following a court order, she was committed to a state psychiatric hospital. The studio, having profited from her films, refused to intervene or use its influence to secure better treatment. They were content to let her be institutionalized, removing the costly problem of a rebellious star. Farmer's story is the ultimate example of a studio turning a star's vulnerability and defiance into a tool for professional and personal annihilation. They blackmailed her by weaponizing her mental state, proving that non-compliance would lead to the total destruction of her career and reputation.